Hello, everyone. This is part two of my review of Andrew Wilson's book. Great book. Love it, you know. So what I'm going to do in this one is that I brushed over in part one the alternative views to study of scribal habits. So I just gave the stat, and what I'm going to go into a bit more detail to look at the methodology used by modern scholars who argue against Royce's study single readings, Royce's and Carroll's study single readings. So this is a focus on chapter two, really good chapter um, in the book. Yeah. And so let's go and feel free to make comments, criticisms. Well, I don't say that, but yeah, feel free to criticize. Yeah. So main arguments, and there may be more, but one of the main arguments that a single reading may not be a single reading could be later identified with further discovery of manuscripts not to be found to be a single reading. So saying it's sort of preempting that if we have discovery of uh, manuscripts would show that the single reading is not a single reading, that the single reading could have been copied from an exemplar. Now, the reality is today we work with what we have. So, for example, we don't know all the manuscripts used by Stephanus, Beza, etc. You could use that argument. So we have what we have, and we have to work with what we have. I think that's fairly reasonable. Um, Royce and others do not say it's the perfect system, but it's a system that can be used with any type of manuscript, like the papyri, manuscripts, and lectionaries, and it's fairly robust. But let's look at some of the alternatives. Yeah. So as I showed in the last one, and what I've done to put percentages, that you've got different methodologies. One of them is the comparison with the Nessus land as the base text. So you look at manuscripts and you compare them to the Nessus land, and there's a problem with that. But even then, the results are scribes omitted more than they added, and not just omitted more than they added, but the figure seems to go up. So you've got basically 60-40 split when you use Royce's study of singular readings. But when you compare against the Nestles on land, you get 74-26, 70-30, 74-26, 60-40. So even then, it confirms the reading. So let's go into some more. We've got more studies. You've got Elijah Hixson. Now, this one was interesting. I really wanted to go into, I actually downloaded this paper. Elijah Hixson, I remember I was on Facebook and someone said, "Oh, do you know Elijah Hickson's study has disproved Royce's study of singular readings with reference to scribal habits?" Now, that one particularly interested me. Um, so I'll go into that in details. Farnes, I think that's a very good study, right? Very sound study. Um, so with Farnes, he actually used exemplars and copies, which are very rare. He used them. Peter Gurry, sorry, he did singular readings using Royce's method, but he also done one where you compare CBGM variant readings um, against for additions and omissions. But even then, with those different methodologies, so you've got the Nestles compared to Nestles land, scribes still omitted more than they added. I'm not going to pronounce it all. I can't speak German. Methodology, you've got 55-45. Family readings, that's where you get more additions and omissions. Farnes using an exemplar with copies, and he gets a very small amount. He gets 80-20, and Peter Gurry, much closer with additions and additions. And we're going to do like a bit of a deep dive into each of those methodologies. I hope you find it interesting. So one of the things the correct way, and one of the problems is um, you're supposed to gather evidence, and I think Westcott and Hort said that knowledge of documents, yeah, emphasize knowledge of documents precede documents. I'm paraphrasing there, but you gather the evidence, you analyze the evidence, and then you produce your theory. It doesn't go the other way around. You don't have the theory, and then you try backtrack to find a methodology which fits that theory. You gather evidence, analyze evidence. Where the evidence takes you, you go with it. Okay. I don't think anybody has a problem should have a problem with what I just said there. So Moises Silva. Now, Moises Silva, I remember reading a book. we made a comment in book by David Allen Black, and he said, yes, we still have to keep the quarter reading. And so let's look at this. He actually made a study, two studies on scribal habits. This is the one where they compared to the Nestle Land 26. He made two studies of scribal habits, Papri 46, Aleph, A, B, and D, first in Philippians, then in Galatians with the same manuscript minus D. His studies are important for a few reasons, not the least being the influence they had on subsequent debate over the shorter reading canon. He was desperate to keep hold of the shorter reading canon. So, despite the evidence what he got, he was desperate. Right. So, further rather use Cowan and Royce's singular method, he catalogued difference within Nestle's Land 26. Now, I think Barbara Land mentioned this as well. Her criticism of the methodology, what it needs to be compared within Nestle's Land. Now, there's a big problem with that. We'll go into that. Okay. What did he end up? Now, this is a breakdown of each of the manuscripts. So, as you can see, when you compare with the Nestles of Land, you get a greater disparity between omissions and additions. So, it's 88% to 12% for Upright 46, Sinaiticus 73, 27. Alexandrus goes the other way, where there's more additions than omissions. Vaticanus 81 to 19%, 74 to 26. And I'm going to explain about Alexandrus. Uh, so look at that there, right? So on average, it was 74 to 26% omission. So it's more than if you followed the basic singular uh, reading methodology, because in that case, what you would find is normally 60-40, about that, thereabout. However, here's the issue. The reason for this anomalous of anomalous is that he shows deviations from the United Bible Society text. Now, we know that the Letters of the Land and the United Bible Society text is based primarily on two chief witnesses, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So we know that A is, I think, it's Byzantine in the Gospels, Alexandrian in the other Pauline epistles. So his results show that A has a longer text in comparison with A and B, which it does. Right? But this leaves unresolved the issue whether A tends to add or whether A and B tend to omit, because you're comparing with a Greek New Testament based primarily on Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But there's another issue as well. When you read the textual commentary, Metzler's textual commentary, it said it quite explicit in his textual commentary that they follow the shorter reading. It's quite clear in terms of internal habits. They follow the shorter reading. All right. So, in a sense, you're already front. But what happens is it exaggerated the numbers or expanded the numbers, but it still shows that scribe's more likely to omit than add. Still holding on. So, despite Silva almost bringing it with produces, and it shouldn't be so hard, but despite the evidence, what he's produced, he still wants to hold it on. So he says, look what he says. At first blush, it may appear that my figures support Royce. In fact, however, the old prince is still valid. He's still holding on despite his own evidence. As long as you keep in mind that its proponent, especially Griesbach, qualified it carefully by accepting certain variants, such as those small and important words that are easily missed, explained by homoteleton, right? It's true that P46 has much larger of emissions additions, but most of the emissions indeed involve functional words or as a result of homoteleton. Perhaps worthy of note in this connection that among all of the emissions in the form landscape, only one involves a verb. So still holding on. Right. There are some interesting observations to be drawn from this evidence, but Silva's main argument is that if we exclude unimportant words, function words, in case of homoteleton in line with Griesbach's canon, we specifically list these exceptions, then we can find the hat canon holds good. That scribes actually tend to add rather than omit. Even when you take out the function words, your nouns, your verbs, your phrases, scribes tend to omit more than they added. So I don't get it. You have produced your own methodology different to Royce and Cowell, but you still come up with the same scribes omitted. How many methodologies do you have to produce to come up with the right answer, if you see what I'm saying? Okay. Elijah Hixson. This is the most problem. I remember this is the one I was also very interested in because I said I was on Facebook and I was having a debate with somebody and he said, Elijah Hickson's methodology has blown Voice's method out of the water. Now, here's the thing. You can see a problem virtually straight away. What he'd done, you have the three purple manuscripts, N, O, and Sigma. And so they're considered daughter manuscripts or a now lost exemplar. So we don't have the exemplar. So what he's done, he reconstructed the text of the exemplar by putting my majority vote between the three surviving manuscripts. And then he looked at different wordings to the other two, took the reading of the two scribes and reflect the exemplar. So this is what he did. And then he used a singular reading method to set up his or Riftin method. That's why he had three different results. So, but here's a question for Elijah Hixson, not they'll answer me. Why did he not follow Farnes' method by using actual manuscripts? And this is the thing about Farnes' one, it's probably the best one, because he actually used an exemplar and copies. And but it produces very few results. So why did instead of reconstructing one, there was one there he could have used. Problem with Hixson's method, it cannot be duplicated, right? So you couldn't use it with papyri. You certainly couldn't use it with the major codices. You couldn't use it with the minuscules. You couldn't. It's so rare that you have daughter manuscripts with a long lost exemplar. But it's not a methodology you could use for any type of manuscript. And also, with all that effort, why use a methodology, reconstruction exemplar, which, despite the efforts, do not produce enough results to establish a theory? You have enough results to establish a theory. That's why Wilson's one is so good because he goes into prior minuscules, majuscules, and lettering throughout time. Here's the issue. Yeah, as I said before, you can't duplicate, seen as few other sibling manuscripts. His methodology is very hard to understand, misleading its conclusions. It mixes up single readings with family readings, and readings that the entire manuscript edition contains. Out of all the methodologies, it's the least satisfactory for procedure for studying Bible habits, combining a complicated method, limiting material, confusion of terms, and misleading conclusions. So, for example, there's certain things which are omitted and studying Scribal habits, but he includes because with all that effort, it produces so little results. Peter Gurry. First of all, I really love the work they do on the CBGM in terms of the work where it's producing all these variants. Um, I have to appreciate the amount of work that they've actually put into this. I have to give maximum respect for that. So what he does, I think he's used a singular methodology, but then he uses CBGM. So basically, but he still comes up with scribes more like to admit than add. So so this is what he did. So he used singular method and he used CBGM, but he still scribes more like to admit than add. All right. Peter describes his method of identifying singular readings in the ECM as follows, using the electronic database behind the ECM apparatus. The simple matter, filter readings are tested by a single witness. Now, if you have ECM, right, I've got two up there, one on up, and I think the Hypnotic Gospel. And one thing you will notice, it's not like a singular word. You've got a number of words and you've got variants. Sometimes they're moved around, saying the same thing, but they're moved around. But I'll go into examples of that. So basically, if it's got a single witness, they class it as a singular reading. But there will be a problem, as I will show you. So basically, because the ETM often combines a number of different readings, an omission or a transposition, or an addition or substitution into a single line, the ECM will list a single witness for a reading. So I'm going to give you a practical example of that. So James 1:1. And as you can see that Kai Patros has one witness, 378. But Kai appears in all three, A, B, and C. Patros appears also in B with 14 manuscripts. So it's not really singular reading per se, yeah? So, for example, you know, you couldn't say, so, but they would class that. Now, remember, if you look at A is Kai. D is a longer reading, Kai Patros. So that would be classed as an addition. So if you see that the one attested by a single manuscript, what you find is that they class as an addition if it's longer than A. Okay. So in this example, C is found in only one manuscript, but would presumably count as a single reading. But it's counted as an addition because it's longer than A reading. However, B also has the same addition of Patros, along with a transposition. So reading C is not counted as a single reading, but we falsely counted as such by Gurry's method. Let's go on. Let's give you another example. James 4:2. What you will notice that D is naturally longer than A, so this would be classed as an addition. But what I've done, if you look at Kai and Ook, Ook is found in A, B, C, and D. I is found in B and D, right? So, an example, D appears as a single addition because rings are only found in one witness, but is longer than A, so therefore it class an addition. However, the addition of Kai is not singular, only the substitution of the Naske is singular. Gurry's method would again falsely count this as a single addition. I'm on a roll here. Now look at this one here. Um, you look at D, yeah. So you've got as a class of single reading 2805, but you look at in terms of phenomene, yeah, phenomene, right? It's found in A, B, C, and D. D. So if you look, the only thing is that, and if you look at the omission of a definite article, it agrees with B, really. So which has 03, 025 plus 14 other manuscripts. So in a sense, right, is that so it's not really a singular reading, yeah? Although it's not. So CBGM scribal tendencies, and also the other issue is that the A reading um, is influenced by the shorter reading. Because that's going to be NA29. So, and I think NA28 as well. So it's influenced by the shorter reading canon. So it counts the readings that depart from its text as non-authorial readings. However, we know that a text has an inbuilt preference for shorter readings, in line with the traditional short reading canon, a preference for certain witnesses that are known to have a shorter text. So this basically reintroduces a possibility of bias toward shorter readings. Okay, so it involves circular reading, hidden support. In order to have a further control on the reasonableness of our procedure of denying singular readings, Irving Allen Sparks, goodbye, suggests at the time of his writing his dissertation that the readings are isolated and the final step be checked where possible against the files of the IGNT, International Greek New Testament Project at Claremont. Two of the papyri B45, 75 contain portions of Luke, which are collections of the IGNTP were virtually complete of the continuous text Greek manuscripts at least. And it would be possible to discover what, if any, support might appear for Royce's singular readings. Yeah. And he also reported that hidden support for singular was meager indeed. So let's look at Greece Mark. I just want to go to Greece Mark. What you'll notice here is this is in uh, Royce's, uh, Wilson's book, page 326. He compares Greek New Testament. So you've got the TR, the Byzantine Robson Pierpoint, Greek Bark. And what you'll notice that Greece Bark, and he was the one who brought the rules in. His Greek New Testament is quite close to the Robertson Pierpoint, way closer than the Nestors of Land. So he didn't apply. So how you can tell how he applied it is in his own Greek New Testament, and he wasn't as happy to exclude manuscripts as uh, modern textual critics today. So look how he applied it. Yeah. Okay. Look what he says, Wilson. He said our current critical text still tends to follow closely the text of Westcott and Hort, and particularly the shorter readings of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. There's very little difference between modern day Nestle-Aland and West Greek New Testament. We've not seen the graph below is our current critical text is not too different in length to that of West Hall. So if you look at the graph before, the irony of modern attempts to defend the short reading canon by pointing to Griswold's carefully nuanced formulation of it is that Griswold himself retained many variation units in his texts. He often preferred the longer reading precisely because the exception clauses meant that in case of homoteleton or smaller omissions, we must not prefer the shorter reading. So look how he had practically applied his own canons. One of the things I put this in here is in the previous presentation. Now, one of the arguments is that Byzantine type manuscripts, they add rather than omit. But if you look, there's a consistency of omissions over additions. So if we follow what modern text epistles have said, we'd expect to see the figure of additions exceed that of omissions. And right through to the stage of the lectionaries, they still omitted more than they added. Okay, conclusion. So the survey has shown that despite unanimous evidence of scribes tend to admit, no one wants to admit the traditional canon is wrong. Some prefer to retain the shorter reading, either in the theory or in practice, while others adopt an agnostic attitude to it. So they realize it's wrong, but let's have an agnostic attitude. Let's say, act like we don't know, despite every studying scribal habits, whatever, if you want to compare to the Nestle-Aland, you want to have exemplar, whatever you want to do, right? Scribes tend to omit more than they added. In fact, no modern scholar disputing the single reading methodology referred ever to read Griesbach. Now, this is what I want to bring out here, is that no modern scholar said, let's go back to Griesbach's methodology, because there isn't one. So in seeking to establish a methodology that would support the shorter reading canon, all they did was confirm it. So they said, right, Royce and Cowell, let's create our own study scribal habits, our own methodology. They didn't use, there was no Griesbach methodology. And even he didn't apply it how they apply it, because we can see that his Greek New Testament is very similar to Robertson Pierpoint. All right. So in seeking to establish a methodology that would support the shorter reading canon, it just confirmed the longer, that scribes were more likely to omit it than add. Okay. Michael Holmes, last word from Mr. Holmes. He wrote, in the light of Roy's study, the venerable canon of Lecto, Brevio, Potio is now seen as relatively useless, at least for the papyri. Now he's referring to Royce, but now we've got Andrew Wilson's study and Paulson and Head and Robinson, Juan Hernandez. We can look right throughout history. It is not only just useless for papyri, useless for majuscules, minuscules, and lectionaries. Okay. Hope you enjoyed that, and as much as I did in preparing it. And no doubt James Knapp will find errors in spelling there. So that's what scribal habits do, isn't it? Take care. God bless.